Welcome back to How to Read the Bible. In our last class, we looked at the history of this book called the Bible, how it came to be in its current form, from the Jewish scriptures to the era of the early church to the European Reformation and into modern times. Today's class will be immensely important as we're laying the groundwork for the methodology of interpretation we'll be using, not just for the rest of our course, but in all our courses. A simplified way of saying this, we're going to learn a skill in how to better approach and understand the text we're reading, so that we can be more informed interpreters. This skill is a cornerstone in all that we'll be learning, in all the text studies we'll be doing, and it is such a vital tool to empower ourselves with if we are to approach any text in the Bible in a responsible way. The method we'll be exploring is called exegesis. You may recall we mentioned exegesis in the introduction to this course, when we looked at why method matters, and we said the method we endorse and apply at Zeteo School is exegesis and biblical theology, specifically with the subcategory of covenant theology. And we already touched on why we've made these choices. Now, the goal, the outcome of what we learn in the coming days is that each of us should be able to go away and conduct an exegetical reading of any biblical passage by ourselves. Not perfectly, but to a far higher standard of competency. The aim is for each of us to start building that competency in this method and to have these tools as lifelong skills that we can keep applying as we read the Bible. So with that, let's get started. We are going to begin by learning some first principles of exegesis. And as we do, I would warmly recommend you to take notes, especially if this is an information retention method which works for you. Jot down these bullet points, these steps, because you're going to be invited to actually apply them by yourself. You'll be given some homework later on, where you'll be invited to exegete a text applying the principles we now learn. Just to remind ourselves, exegesis is a method of analyzing the biblical text. It is a method which centers around context, applying a contextual reading. We'll look at what that actually means, we'll demonstrate how this works, what it practically looks like, and how you yourself can apply that. The word exegesis comes from the Greek exegesis, from exegeomai, meaning to lead out. And as we journey together, we'll see why this name is so apt for this method. As we learn about exegesis in the next few classes, here is the outline of what we will be covering. Number one, as I mentioned, will introduce the foundations, the first principles of the exegetical method. Secondly, we will then look at the world of the Old Testament. We'll explore narrative, genre, plot, and character. So that's what you can expect from our upcoming classes. With that overview, let's begin on today's topic, the first principles of exegesis. We've said that at the heart of exegesis is context, contextual reading. But what context are we talking about when we say this? Primarily, we're talking about the context of the larger biblical text. And secondarily, we're talking about the context of the world and culture in which that biblical text was originally written. So let's first look at the primary context, the context of the larger text. You can pick a verse, any verse from the Bible, Old Testament or New Testament, and you can try to discern what that verse means, what it's trying to say. But one verse doesn't sit in a vacuum, does it? And so we must ask ourselves, what is this single verse surrounded by, this single sentence? Well, other verses, other sentences. This is what we call the textual context. Let's take an example of perhaps the most famous Bible verse, John 3:16. We know this as, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever trusts him shall not perish, but have eternal life. So that's our one verse, verse 16. What is the textual context of verse 16? Well, the nearest context is the verse before and the verse after. Verse 15 and verse 17. In this case, we'll say verse 14 and 15, so not to chop a sentence in two. Verse 14, just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who trusts may have eternal life in him. And the verse after, verse 17, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. All right, now we've looked at what comes directly before and directly after verse 16. Now we zoom out a bit. We take another step back to get a better view. What does the rest of the paragraph say? And after we've done this, we zoom out a bit more. We look at not some, but all the surrounding verses of that chapter, chapter 3, reading what verses 1 to 16 says, and 16 to the end of the chapter, verse 36. Now we suddenly start to get an even better understanding of the meaning of John 3:16. We realize important contextual information such as that it's Jesus speaking in verse 16, and we learn that he is speaking to a Pharisee named Nicodemus. We learn the setting of this conversation. It's the dead of night, and this seems to be a secret meeting. We learn how this conversation came about. We learn what topics are being discussed in this conversation. Then we take yet another step back. Now, what are the surrounding chapters about? What is chapter 2 about? What is chapter 4 about? We zoom out yet again. Our vision widens, not just to chapters, but what is the book about? The book of John. What is the story? What is the theme? What is the message? Who was it written by? What story leads us up to John 3:16 happening? What events take place after John 3:16? Now, all this may seem ridiculously obvious. Stating that textual context is looking at the surrounding text may seem as unnecessary as saying a spoon is a spoon. But when it comes to how we read the Bible and extrapolate meaning from its verses, it would appear that this needs to be spelled out, and spelled out again and again, because it's a practice that isn't done often or well. If there were any other book, any other piece of literature, it might be rather obvious to read a sentence in its greater context, as part of the bigger story, in the context of the whole article or the whole chapter or the book. We rarely buy a novel, open it up to a random page, read one sentence, and then declare we have perfectly grasped what the author meant to say by that sentence. So why do we do this with the Bible? This is the way the Bible is often approached and treated. We have a learned tendency, a habit, of plucking a verse out of its textual context, to cut out a sentence and paste it into whatever we'd like to say or argue, and by doing so, we often miss its actual meaning, because, as in all things in life, context massively colors the meaning of our words and sentences and events. And this is what we mean by textual context: surrounding verses, surrounding paragraph, surrounding chapter, chapters, and finally, book. This practice of zooming out may seem too simple to have any massive effect, but we will find how striking a difference it will make if we begin doing this every time we read and study a text. In fact, let us try this right now. Let's apply this to Exodus 14:14. It reads, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." You may be well familiar with this verse. I have heard it many times. In fact, this sentence has been used as a bit of a Christian mantra, if you will. taken out of context and applied to be a larger general life principle about faith, that God will fight for you in your life. All you have to do is to be still, be quiet, wait for him. I have seen this sentence hanging on bedroom walls and printed on t-shirts, spoken in words of advice and highlighted in Bibles. But now, let's apply our new tool. Let's apply our textual context method. First step, reading the verse directly before and directly after. Verse 13, "But Moses said to the people, 'Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You have only to keep still.' Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on.'" Okay, so already verse 15 has dramatically changed the meaning of verse 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on." Let's now go to step 2, zooming out a little further to see the paragraph, going back to verse 10. "As Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites looked back, and there were the Egyptians advancing on them. In great fear, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, 'Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone, so that we can serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness.'" Then we open up the context window even further, and we discover the larger scene of what's taking place here, the larger story. God has acted to bring out an enslaved people, called the Israelites, from their bondage in Egypt. But after they've left, the ruler of Egypt, called Pharaoh, regrets his decision to release them, and him and his vast army are chasing after the Israelites. Now, the Israelites are caught between the Egyptian army and the Red Sea. As the army approaches, the Israelites blame Moses for their situation. They say, "We told you to leave us alone. Why did you bring us out of Egypt?" Despite the terrible and oppressive situation they had newly been delivered from, they are expressing a want to return to it, expressing that they didn't have a want to leave in the first place. Quite a stirring reality. We start to gain a picture of a people who long for their past, no matter how bad that past was. A people who perhaps have no concept of freedom, who cannot imagine or even want something better, and who think they are facing inescapable death. And now we begin to better understand the back and forth that is leading up to verse 14. "But Moses said to the people, 'Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You have only to keep still.'" This is Moses' attempt at assuring the people, saying, "Don't be afraid. The Lord will sort this out for us. There's better things ahead than behind. Just stand still and wait." Now, that may seem like a good and sturdy faith response on Moses' part. But then we have this next verse. God actually objects to Moses' instructions to the people. He says to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on." Now, at this point, we may be scratching our heads wondering, move where? They're caught between an army and the sea. And so we read the verses that follow to gain a contextual understanding. Because verse 15 isn't the end of God's speech. He continues to speak in verse 16. "But you lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the Israelites may go into the sea on dry ground." What follows is God parts the sea, making a dry, safe path for the people to pass through to the other side. Moses saying, "Stand still and wait," sounded nice, but God objects and says, "No, I have other plans. I am acting to move you to safety. Don't stand still. Move forward. Don't stop. Act on what it is that I'm doing." And these are polar opposite instructions, opposite meanings of the text. This is just one tiny example of why textual context matters so much. How a general good-sounding thought about faith was not right or relevant in this context. It wasn't the time to stand still. It was the time to move forward. Not plucking out one sentence here and there that sounds nice or suits us and turning that sentence into a faith mantra or even a doctrine, but reading it, understanding it in its original place. Verses don't exist in a vacuum. Look at the surrounding verses, passage, chapter, book. And a huge upside is, in order to apply textual contextualization, you don't even need to go to any other sources or be a historical scholar. You already have access to begin using this tool right there in the text in front of you. So, there we have the first principle of exegesis, textual context. Just a quick note here before we move on to our next principle. It is useful to be aware that if you read any academic analysis or commentary on Bible texts, you will sometimes see this sort of thing, verse 14b or verse 12a. Just so we're aware, some Bible verses are quite long. A person may wish to only bring attention to the first part or the last part of the verse, and so will indicate this by adding an a B, or sometimes even a C to the verse number. An example of this from the chapter we were just looking at. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So this verse has more than one sentence. If you wish to make a reference to the first part, you'd write this as 21a. If you wish to reference the last part, you'd refer to it as 21b. That's just a little useful tool to be aware of, whether you use it or not. Okay, we will now look at another principle that is so important that we grasp, and that is the author-centered approach versus the reader-centered approach. As you sit having your morning coffee, perhaps doing your morning devotional, reading through the Psalms or Isaiah, maybe you have out your colored highlighters to underline passages with, looking for words that will inspire you as you go to school or work. It is easy to believe that this document was made entirely for you, and with you in mind. For you as a 21st century reader, sipping your 21st century coffee, sitting in your 21st century chair. Western readers of the Bible have been taught to primarily ask, what does the text mean to me? How does this text serve me? What do I get out of it? This is a very individual-centered mindset. We call this a reader-centered approach. In a reader-centered approach, it is the reader who determines the meaning of the text. The subjective interpretation and consumption of the reader is what is seen to give the text its meaning. So the text means what I get out of it. But of course, although the Bible can deeply impact individual lives and feel very relevant to our individual journey, it wasn't written for one person. Nor was it written in the 21st century. Still, the Bible is often approached in this way, from the culture, time, and subjective context of the reader. But as you can imagine, this is neither responsible nor effective if we are trying to discern the original meaning of the text, the original intent of the Bible passage. Because, of course, it is not us, but the authors, the people who wrote these books, who are the ones who know what they meant when they wrote what they wrote. As much as the words written by David thousands of years ago can encourage you in your workplace, you are not the definer of its meaning. It's not like a piece of modern art, where it's the viewers who decide what the piece means. There was an original, intended meaning behind what is written in the Bible. And to really get closer to that original intention, we have to de-center ourselves as subjective 21st century readers, to resist that urge, to immediately jump to the, well, what does this mean for us today? And begin by recentering the author. Included in recentering the author comes recentering the author's culture, their historical context, their life journey, their experiences, their geographical setting and ideology. Only when we do this can we get closer to restoring the meaning behind what we're reading. When we get a better picture of the author, we get a better picture of their work. And so when we exegetically study the text, we will be asking the big question, what is the author's meaning? In much of modern Bible study, the reader is king, but we take that crown and hand it back to the writer. Now, some Bible books include information about its writer, about their life, who they are, their setting. This may, for example, be done in the introduction. And in other cases, we also benefit from going to secondary sources to learn about the particular historical and cultural setting of the author. We'll be demonstrating more about how to apply an author-centered reading later in this class, but we have just for now identified this first principle. Now we move on to the next. When we practice exegesis, we try to do something that seems impossible. We try to read the text as though we're reading it for the first time. Now, this is an odd-sounding practice, particularly for those who have been reading this book for years, who might have grown up in faith communities and read the Bible several times, cover to cover. How do I read a story, read a passage, as though for the first time, when I've already heard the story of David and Goliath? I know what happens with Abraham and Isaac when Jesus heals the blind man. I've heard it many times before. Well, it's a bit similar to entering a discussion with an open mind. That in itself may be something we need to practice more of. But it's this internal decision before you even begin, an internal commitment to trying to listen before we speak, to learn before we assume, because assumption is precisely the problem which so many Bible literate people have. We assume we know the story. We assume we know what the text means. And the truth is, that isn't always the truth. We don't always know what the text is really saying. Additionally, we often miss things in the text because we're not actively observing. We don't expect to see anything new there, and so we don't. Here is a simple but effective example. I'd like us to picture right now a scene from the Bible, from the Nativity story. Joseph and Mary are traveling towards the town of Bethlehem, where Jesus is soon going to be born. I'd like us to now imagine them traveling there on the road to Bethlehem. See them in your mind's eye. Is there a donkey in your scene? Is Mary riding on a donkey led by Joseph? The answer for many of us will be yes. That is what I was picturing. Yet nowhere in the biblical text, in any of the four Gospels, is there mention of a donkey in this scene. No mention of Mary riding on any sort of animal. But that mental image has been cemented in the imagination of many of us because of artistic depictions and Christmas cards, sermons and songs. The truth is that Mary could have been riding on a donkey, and she could have been walking. She might have been riding in the back of a drawn cart. Joseph might have needed to carry her. She may have already had contractions beginning on the road. We simply do not know. The point here is that we read with biased eyes, with presuppositions, with already formed opinions and mental pictures. In fact, sometimes it's easier for someone who has never read any of the Bible to approach the text with the right eyes, easier than for people who believe they are deeply familiar with it. And so when we look at a passage, we're going to try to imagine as though we're reading it for the first time, as though we don't already know what we'll find as we enter the room. We try to notice details. Look around you. Let the story unfold. Try to quiet that rushing voice saying, "Yeah, I already know this. I know what comes next." This is a discipline. We become better at it by practicing. We can practice on using the skill to become better observers. And no, observing does not entail scouring the text, looking for that golden nugget so that you can win an argument with another church member. Treat it like when you go to a museum and you walk from painting to painting, taking your time. You notice the theme, the mood, the colors, the character placements, the brushstrokes, the lighting. Each time you're going to exegetically analyze the text, it begins here with this: reading as though for the first time. This is the first step we're going to take before we even get to anything else. Our next principle: when we exegete a passage, we are going to do more than one reading. We just mentioned that on our first pass, we read the text as though for the first time, and we talked about the zooming out verse, passage, chapter, book. But when we study a passage, it's important to read it more than once. We take a second pass and a third and more if needed. Keep going over it. Keep noticing. This may seem mundane and even silly, but going over a text several times can be quite effective at highlighting things you didn't notice the first time round. Because we can't notice everything at once. This practice will help us pick up patterns and structures we didn't see at first. So when we carry out exegesis, we read the passage several times, which leads us to the next step, noticing things that stand out. Sometimes we'll come across things in the text which seems strange to us. Out of place, things which don't make sense, seem random, things which are odd or seem to contradict themselves. Now, typically, we've been trained to gloss over these things, to move on, let the mystery lie. If there's something which bothers us in a text, we kind of ignore or chalk it up to being some quirky fluke, or we feel like we're doing something heretical by even noticing it. There's a recoil reaction from things that leave us uncomfortable or confused in the Bible. And this sadly comes from a long history of clergy-enforced discouragement of people's questions, doubts, and challenges about the Bible. But this often robs us of journeys we're meant to take, of what is sometimes intentionally placed things which stand out in the text. We'll see this in our coming text studies. This is a style found in both Greek and particularly Hebrew writing. What stands out is often meant to be noticed. Frequently, the author places a purposeful inclusion of a detail. It is a thread there that we're meant to pull at. It's saying something. And then other times, what stands out to us about the text as a problem or an oddity wasn't placed there by the author for this purpose. But if we pursue understanding what stood out to us, it is so often leads us to a better, deeper understanding or insight into the text. In my experience, 9 out of 10 times, that thing which is bothering me in a narrative is where a treasure trove lies. We must push against our inner voice to not notice these things, and instead follow that thread. See where it takes you. Research, listen, notice. Sometimes there is beauty and revelation at the end of a journey that begins with confusion. So, We're going to get into the habit of, after we've done our first reading our text as if for the first time, then we'll do our second pass and our third pass, and during this we're going to write down things that stand out to us, that seem odd or out of place or leave us scratching our head. Write it down. Next, we shall talk about details, expensive details. If you recall, we touched on how animal skin scrolls were expensive, and they needed to be preserved and stored as well. So when the authors of the books of the Bible were writing their documents, particularly in the Old Testament, there is a brevity to their writing. It's not like modern stories, modern novels, where you can take the time and pages to build the environment, the mood, to set the scene and furnish your story. This can be a bit frustrating to modern readers, thinking, why is there so little detail? I don't even know what the main character looks like. It's all so brief and choppy. Surely that's not a good way to tell a story. It's not like modern novels. But this sparseness of detail is not due merely to cultural style. It is again because parchment was expensive. And so you're not going to waste words, are you? You're not going to waste space on describing someone's appearance, their hair length, the color of the walls, the weather on the day of a battle, unless it's central to the plot, unless it's important. You're going to give the bare bones of the story. So recorded Hebrew narrative was about conciseness and brevity. Except sometimes we do find a detail here and there, don't we? The author, in his brevity, suddenly, quite oddly, takes the time to mention what sort of tree King Saul is sitting under, or the type of food someone is eating. A little comment about a character's appearance, leading us to ask, well, why did the author feel the need to point that out? Why did he put that in there? Because Hebrew writers didn't waste space, you know that if they are including particular details, chances are we're meant to pay attention to it. It's a way of the author going, look here, notice this. And because we now understand that this is uncommon, we know these details aren't window dressing or mere aesthetics. We're meant to pay attention to them because it's likely telling us something. We'll go further into this when we apply this principle during a text study coming up in our character class later on in this course. Next, we look at the dividing up of passages. Most of us who have English Bible translations will have the same thing. Our Bible is divided into books, then chapters, then verses. And in some versions, within the chapters, we also have these little subheadings above paragraphs. These little headings briefly summarize what the chunk of text is about. Now, because we have now learned about how we got the text we have today, we know that these dividers were not in the original text. Ezekiel didn't sit writing little verse numbers above the lines in his scroll. The original manuscripts were one big block of text, and typically they were meant to be read in one go. And it's worth being aware of this when you're applying contextual reading. That although those chapters and verse divisions are very helpful to us today, don't let them completely dictate the way you're reading the text. Sometimes those headings don't do the best job at summing up what the paragraph is really about. And sometimes modern versions chop a bigger story in half, with half the story in chapter 2 and the other half in chapter 3, meaning that we might miss that they are connected or a continuation of the same thought. We find such an example in the very first chapters of the Bible, Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1 ends in verse 31, but really, if you read the story, it should end in chapter 2, verse 4, with chapter 2 beginning in 2:5. So just be aware of this, unnatural divisions, and see beyond the numbers and the subheadings when it's relevant. Let's move on. A part of understanding exegesis is also understanding its counterpart, its opposite, called eisegesis. While exegesis is defined as legitimate interpretation, which reads out of the text what the original author or authors meant to convey, eisegesis, on the other hand, reads into the text what the interpreter wishes to find or thinks they find there. Now, we've already touched on ways we can carry out eisegesis and the problems with it, but we now have an official name for it, and we'll expand further on how we can fall into the trap of doing eisegesis. There's this ongoing joke about English literature classes, where the teacher will have the class deeply analyze excerpts from famous books they're studying, Shakespeare, Ibsen, Austen, Tolstoy, and the teacher will spend an hour waxing poetically about how in this one scene there is the mention of blue curtains in the room. And the teacher will say something like, "Notice how she writes about blue curtains? The choice of blue is a metaphor for the sadness behind the eyes of the main character. Are not the eyes the windows to the soul? The blue curtains foreshadow the melancholy in which the plot will descend into after her great uncle's death in the very next chapter." Meanwhile, the author, the person who actually wrote the thing, included this detail about blue curtains for no other reason than that the author has to describe settings. The curtains just happen to be blue. There was no intended meaning behind blue curtains, no deep metaphor attached. This is to demonstrate that readers of any literature can insert their own misplaced analysis into what others have written, projecting ourselves onto the text and reading into things we were not meant to read into. You may know people who do this. You may have done it yourself while reading the Bible. You may know someone who routinely thinks that every random sentence they read on any particular day is some sort of sign from God about their life or a decision they're about to make. Today I read about Rahab hanging a scarlet cord from her window to save her family's life. This must be a sign for me to wear red today instead of green. I had a classmate who didn't study at all for their university exams and expected to pass because they claimed the promise in Matthew 19:26. With God, all things are possible, completely ignoring the context in which Jesus spoke those words and superimposing them into their own context and their interpretation. A friend of mine had a religious studies teacher who maintained that swarms of locusts in Revelation referred to helicopters, similar sound, flying things, and built an understanding of prophecy being fulfilled in modern times around this theory. Similarly, I knew people from my Adventist high school who claimed that Ellen White was mentioned in the book of Revelation, chapter 3, verse 18. "I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, so that you can become rich, and white clothes to wear so you can cover your shameful nakedness, and salve to put on your eyes so you can see." They argued that this was all about Ellen White because gold was her middle name, the mention of white clothes, and the name Ellen means torch or light, assumed to be mentioned here in connection with the healing of eyes so they can see. Bible study is rife with eisegesis, and the subjective projections of others are endless. And so this is the disciplined balance we have to find when exegeting. Because although we talked about noticing things in the text, paying attention to the details, the other side of that is making sure we don't put things on the text that aren't there. Doing so can lead us to some wild, inappropriate, and harmful places. My husband had an experience of hearing someone talk on the topic of trees in the Bible, And this person maintained that every mention of a tree is a symbol or a shadow of the cross. And this is a perfect example of eisegesis, reading into the text. Not every mention of a lamb in this book is a prophecy about or an allusion to Jesus. Not every bridegroom is a foreshadowing of Christ. Not every tree symbolizes the cross. In fact, the joke among theologians is not to call it eisegesis, but I see Jesus, referring to how many Bible readers imagine they see Christ throughout the Old Testament and read the New Testament back into the Old in inappropriate ways. Jesus is superimposed into every story, every image, every metaphor, whether that is the author's intention or not. Now, the Old Testament does contain imagery alluding to the coming Messiah and messianic prophecy. We looked at the example of John 3, where Jesus himself connects his cross with the snake on a pole story in Numbers 21 in order to make a point. This is not an imagined connection. Jesus is making it for us. It is clear and deliberate. But not every text is like that. In fact, there's something called contextual ethics. It refers to how we have an ethical obligation to carry out contextual reading of the Bible, because when we don't, we do cause harm and actually affect real lives. History, as we've seen, has repeatedly shown this to us. Racism, anti-blackness has been propped up by non-contextual, eisegetical reading. So was the burning of so-called witches, genocides, mistreatment of the disabled, by equating the disabled with demon possession and the dehumanization of the disabled. That idea has stuck for years in Christian communities, justifying slavery, the mistreatment of women in society, and all so-called backed by the Bible, backed by people who knowingly or unknowingly twist the text into meaning something it doesn't, by eisegeting instead of exegeting. So as we go forward and hopefully each of us decides to practice contextual ethics, it's no small matter what you're doing. It's not merely semantics. It is an ethical obligation to do no harm, to practice responsibly. Again, an excellent remedy for eisegesis, or I see Jesus, is working on replacing our reader-focused approach with the author-centered one. Not what we put in the text, but trying to understand what the author actually meant, and resisting the temptation of seeing a cross in every tree. On to the next principle. When we exegete, we have at our disposal two types of sources. The first we call the primary source. This is the Bible. Anything contained within this canon which helps us to exegete is our primary source. But then we also have what is called secondary sources. Secondary sources can include Bible commentaries, books on historical context, archaeological sources, theological articles, and so on. Basically, any other source aside from the biblical canon is a secondary source. Now, for many, it is very tempting to jump to secondary sources when studying a biblical passage. It is so easy to leap straight into what the commentaries say. Others' analysis, Google, Wikipedia, articles, theological books, sermons. But again, we discipline ourselves to not jump over those first important steps, the steps we've learned so far. Stay within the primary source. Let it simmer. Conduct your first reading of the passage as if you're reading it for the first time. Conduct your second and third and fourth readings, going over the text, writing down things that stand out. Look at it in its immediate context, the nearby verses, chapters, book. Look at the original language. Look at the parsing of words, the grammar. And only then, only when you've done all this, then go to secondary sources if need be. We must let the Bible speak for itself, without the deafening roar of others' opinions drowning out the original text. Don't get me wrong, there are some solid commentaries and theological analysis out there, but when you study a text, it should primarily begin and focus on that text. Ask your own questions, make your own observations, and then consult secondary sources. Here is a simple example of how secondary sources may fall short. Historical critical commentaries on the Book of Esther conclude that Queen Vashti was not a real historical person. This conclusion was made based on her appearing in no other sources than the Bible. No other historical records of her exist. Now, at first, this may make us wonder whether or not the historical accuracy of the Bible can be trusted, but if we take a moment to actually understand the story within Esther, what happened to Queen Vashti? Well, she was banished, wasn't she? The king felt humiliated by her refusal to be shown off like an object to a bunch of drunk officials, and he banished her, striking her name from all records and history, making it as though she had never existed. Of course, there is no lasting record of her. King Xerxes commanded all mention of her to be removed from his empire, under penalty of death, no less. If you understand the story, then this comment of secondary sources is put to rest and placed under the proper light. Now, let's look at the opposite kind of example, where secondary sources lend a helpful insight into clarifying the primary source. In the book of Daniel, we encounter the character of the Babylonian conquering king. According to Daniel, the author of the book, this king's name is Nebuchadnezzar. But when we consult secondary historical sources, we discover that this king's name was actually Nebuchadrezzar. The question then becomes, is the name used in Daniel a mistake? Is this proof that it's not a historically accurate account? Actually, what we find is far more interesting. Daniel, being a Judean exile along with the others of his people, such as Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 28:11, rename or nickname the Babylonian king. Nebuchadnezzar is a play on the king's real name, Nebuchadrezzar. Nebuchadrezzar was a respectable and lofty name in the Akkadian language, language of the Babylonians. It meant Nabu, watch over my heir, or Nabu, watch over my eldest son. Nabu was the name of one of the arch gods in Babylon. But Nebuchadnezzar makes a play on the language and causes the name to mean Nabu, watch over the mule. The belief being that the Judean exiles are making a point of the foolishness or stubbornness of the Babylonian king, hence the nickname. Here, consulting secondary sources helped us not only to reconcile that these two names refer to the same person, but to bring attention to why the author would use such a nickname and what he's trying to say by using it. So, in conclusion, let's use secondary sources while applying critical thinking. A passage doesn't say something merely because a theologian or a scholar maintains it. When exegeting, secondary sources must always be just that, secondary. They can sometimes add to our study, but must play the role of supporting actor to the biblical canon. And with that, we come to the end of our preliminary list. We have now identified some of the main first principles of exegesis, principles we'll be using again and again and applying in coming text studies. We will now move on to another section of today's class, where we'll look at two things: an introduction to the Old Testament world, and we'll also identify a few specific Hebrew literary styles and devices. Now, the reason why we're doing these two things together is that they naturally go hand in hand. Historical setting and culture affects literature. It affects its style. A simple example, towards the end of the 18th century, an artistic and intellectual movement called Romanticism swept through Europe. Romanticism was, in part, a reaction to the preceding Industrial Revolution, bringing back emphasis on the individual, on the intense emotion of aesthetic experience, centering nature, folk art, fairy tales, romance, poetry. And this movement affected what sort of literature was written during this time and what sort of art was created. Literature will mainly always reflect its context and its world. And the Bible is no different. We talked a lot today about contextual reading and recentering the author. Well, in order to understand the author better, we need to understand the author's world better. Where they are in history, where they lived, what their culture was like. And that's why learning about the Old Testament must go together with contextual reading and identifying styles and tools within these pieces of literature. We can, of course, not go into the greatest detail about Near Eastern ancient history. That would take an inordinate amount of time, but we can get a brief overview of things we need to be aware of. Diving into the world of the Old Testament must begin with the awareness of something which perhaps seems quite obvious, but is often missed nonetheless. The ancient Old Testament world was not the Western world. The West is a product of Western thought, history, and culture. So, first thing to be aware of, as modern readers, we are going to experience cultural barriers when reading the text because of the time gap. And if you are a Western reader, you will certainly experience cultural barriers because this literature's setting was different from your own. So we need to expect that. Secondly, as we mentioned, the Old Testament is not the product of Western thought, but Eastern thought. What do we mean by that? When we use the phrase Western thought, we are referring to Western philosophy. Western philosophy refers to the thought and work of the Western world. Historically, the term refers to the philosophical thinking of Western culture, beginning with ancient Greek philosophers. We rationalize, think within certain systems, along certain terms. We use certain tracks of thinking. These systems have been taught to us by our culture, much of it inherited from ancient Greek philosophy. But not everyone in the world shares in these same systems of thought. People living in other parts of the world have different outlooks on the world and methods to understand it, different priorities in life, and a different mentality. The Old Testament world had a different philosophical system, a different thought system than we have in the West. Let us demonstrate this now. Imagine you're standing at a bus stop. Your head is full of questions about the world, your life, the universe. You wonder why you're here, what the purpose of it all is. First, you turn to your right. There sits a Western old woman. You ask her, "What is the meaning of life?" Now, that Western woman's answer will likely look something like this. It will turn to reason, logic, it will be highly philosophical. She will build her argument deductively, layering reason on reason. But now you turn to your left, and there sits a man from the East. "What is the meaning of life?" you ask him. And this man will reply, "Let me tell you a story." The means of understanding the world and explaining it is done very differently. Greek reasoning and logic builds an argument. Eastern thought uses not the language of philosophy, only reason and logic, but answers by engaging the imagination and one's own thought process. This can, of course, feel maddening at times to a Western audience. Just give me the straight answer. Sum it up for me in bullet points. What's the bottom line? The Eastern mindset, however, will turn to story, to poetry, in order to make their point, not automatically to argument. And unlike what Western audiences may claim, it is no less concise or true for it. In fact, one might say that this way of answering such a huge question, like what is the meaning of life, is much more suited to human beings and the way that humans function and work and live. We must bring this understanding with us as we read the Bible. The book is answering large questions, but it does so by telling us a story. And perhaps we can begin to see now that if we miss the culture of the world that it was written in and impose a Greek philosophical structure on the Old Testament, we will likely miss its point. The next thing we should know about the Old Testament world is this. The West is a product of urban society. The East is a product of rural society. This will affect the viewpoint of its authors. It means that they will likely have a narrower horizon. In some cases, there isn't this sense of globalization, but local setting. One family, one village, one town. Many of the Old Testament authors were born in small villages and didn't travel far and wide. And many people lived scattered instead of crammed together in small urban areas. Thus, their writing will have a closer focus. In the Old Testament world, Syria's capital city, called Nineveh, was described as a great city, a massive place. In fact, at the time, it was the biggest city of the ancient world. How many inhabitants did it have? 100,000 people. Today, it is estimated that Tokyo is the largest city by population in the world. It has 37.4 million people. So urban society versus rural. Again, our next point may seem insipidly obvious to state, but it is still something Western readers often forget. The lives of the biblical characters we read about were different from ours. For example, our perspective on the question, where are you from? In the West, we emphasize the importance of national identity. In the Near East, the focus lay on your tribe. Again, a narrower horizon. There was a closer focus on individual identity. Who is your father? What is your tribe? In the West, democracy is talked about like the highest good of social systems. You will find there's little to no democracy in the Old Testament. Certainly not how we would define it. It doesn't see this system as the highest good or the best way to run things. Again, rather obvious, but needs to be stated, information and technology in the ancient Near East was very different from today's Western world. That affects things like information storage, the spreading of news, the way wars were waged, shared knowledge, and so on. A very important point to highlight next is the secular society versus religious society distinction. Today in the Western world, this division, this distinction, exists between the secular and the religious. We compartmentalize these worlds. Whether we like it or not, everyone living in the modern West have been secularized. Even people of faith, religious people divide their lives, even subconsciously, into what has to do with their faith and what doesn't, what is secular and what is sacred or religious. Not so in the ancient Near East. There was no secularism in their world. They didn't make that distinction. They didn't have to remind themselves that something had to do with their religion. People had different gods, yes, but there was no corner of life void of religion. This was the mindset of the Israelites and of the surrounding nations. All aspects of life are religious or spiritual, having to do with God or the gods. And because we either don't understand or don't relate to this, we often find it very difficult to make sense of books like Leviticus, for example. Why are the laws about how to deal with mold and how priests are meant to act all jumbled together in one paragraph? Why are there seemingly religious laws about women's periods and mixed fabrics? We struggle to understand the clean and unclean laws. We struggle to not misrepresent the system today because we don't naturally grasp it. And the result of our attempts are sometimes disastrous. An example of this would be viewing women's periods as being something disgusting, corrupt, or dirty because women would remove themselves from the main Israelite camp during their periods and gather in a separate tent. It can seem to us like they're being removed or exiled due to some gross body function. Sadly, we don't have time to get into the Levitical laws in this course, but for now we'll simply say that our failure to grasp their meaning and systems is due to this. We have a different outlook on the world. In a Hebrew mindset, everything you do is done in the sight, in the presence of God. You don't have a spiritual life and the rest of your life. Thus, nothing is not about your faith. Farming, married life, sex, money, raising of animals, trade, property damage, it's all an expression of spirituality. The Western conclusion to this is often, that's really weird. But the ancients were not odd, rather we have become secularized. And so we view the world differently. Our next point comes back to a difference between Hebrew and Greek thought. I'm putting it this way because Hebrew thought represents much of Near Eastern ancient worldview, and Western philosophy, as we said, was a product inherited from ancient Greek thought or philosophy. So another difference is Greek thought can be quite reductionistic and focus on deduction in order to get at the truth, which we might describe as this or that kind of thinking. Either this is true and factual and real, or that is true and factual and real. Conversely, what we'll sometimes see in Hebrew thought is a this and that thinking. Hebrew thought maintains that there is so much complex truths in life and the world, and sometimes reductionism steals away part of the picture's truth. Because as we know from life experience, this can be true and that can be true at the same time. If we understand this, we'll understand many, not only narratives, but poetry in the Bible too. How can David exclaim that he's utterly abandoned by God in his suffering, and yet maintain that God never abandons him in the next sentence? Well, David, as a Hebrew writer, is making space for this deeply complex experience of personal pain and faith, feeling abandoned and yet not being abandoned. Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest. But then we come to verse 3. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you our ancestors put their trust. They trusted in you, and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. Well, does God save or doesn't he? Is he trustworthy or isn't he? Is he powerful and able or not? Hebrew spirituality doesn't shy away from the multifaceted phenomena that is the human experience, of faith and despair, of current experience versus past experience, You and I both know that we can hold great complexity within ourselves all at the same time. It's a this and that outlook. And the final element of the Old Testament world we'll look at this point also includes very much the New Testament, and that is the oral tradition. Many of the books in the Bible were meant to be read in one sitting, not pieced up, chopped up for analysis and commentary, but as one complete story or text. If you read a whole book in one sitting, it affects the experience you have with it compared to if you go in with the scissors. And not only were many of these books meant to be read in one sitting, they were meant to be read out loud. They were meant to be read to a group of listeners. And if you have some knowledge about poetry, you'll know that poetry is created to be read out loud, and that having a text read to you orally generates a different experience than sitting reading it alone in the silence of your head. For example, the letters of Paul. Paul and other apostles of Jesus wrote letters, which we today call epistles, to groups of believers all around the Roman Empire and beyond. The letter would arrive, and likely on that same Shabbat, someone in the community, like a spiritual leader, would read the letter out loud to the congregation. That's how they'd receive Paul's words. Imagine for a moment how different the delivery and the reception of this text would be in that setting, as opposed to approaching Paul's letters like a dogmatic theological document of doctrine. If you read the whole of Romans in one sitting, you might begin to see how each chapter is a continuation of the last chapter's thoughts, that it's one big point and there's forward momentum. It's all going somewhere. It's not just a statement here and there. And so it's worth considering these Old and New Testament books which were made to be read out loud, and how that might affect how we approach them, hear them, think about their audience and delivery. Okay, we will now move into our second section where we look at some typical and common Hebrew literary tools and devices. Because believe it or not, the books of the Bible are pieces of literature. And if anyone here has studied literature before, they know that understanding the type and style of a piece of literature can dramatically open up our digestion and interpretation of the text. So the first thing to say here is that there are numerous genres in the Bible, sometimes even several genres within a single book. We have genealogy, poetry, psalms or songs, prophetic oracles, parables. We will look more closely at genre types later on. But for now, we can simplify matters with this summary. There are two main types in which the Old Testament expresses itself: narrative and poetry. We said that we'd look at a few Hebrew literary devices, but a better way of saying this might be peculiarities. Hebrew literature is peculiar. And I use this word in the sense of it meaning particular or distinct, although to Western readers they might experience it more as bizarre or odd at times. Hebrew literature likes to play on words, a bit like puns in English, but of course English readers miss this wordplay if they don't read it in Hebrew. Hebrew wordplay is not done primarily as a humorous activity, although it sometimes is humorous, but to highlight an irony or a connection between things in the text. An example of this can be found in Genesis. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. The Hebrew word here for naked is aromim. Then in the very next verse, 3:1, now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. The Hebrew word for crafty or cunning is arum. You can hear the poetry of it when you say these words out loud. So the humans were arumim, but the serpent was arum. The wordplay is foreshadowing what's about to happen. The upcoming connection between the lack of shame human beings feel about their nakedness and how that will change because of the serpent's craftiness. Another example of wordplay in Genesis. The first man created is called Adam. Adam in Hebrew means human. In fact, throughout the Eden narrative, his name carries the definite article. So in Hebrew, Adam is called Ha-Adam, meaning the human. Now, what was the first human made from? Genesis 2:7, God formed the human out of the dust, earth or soil of the ground. The Hebrew word for earth or dust of the ground is Ha-Adamah. So if we read Genesis in Hebrew, this is what it sounds like. Ha-Adam was formed from Ha-Adamah. In English, it would be Adam made from Adamah. The wordplay connects the human to the earth. And what might that be telling us? Another Hebrew peculiarity is something called multivalence. This is where a word can have several meanings. We find this also in English. The word bark, is it tree bark or the sound a dog makes? Now, multivalence in Hebrew literature is often used on purpose to create a deliberate double meaning. In the book of Jonah, God says that in 40 days the city of Nineveh will be hapak. Now, hapak can mean destroyed or overturned, but the word hapak also means turned around. To turn around is also the Hebrew way of saying converted. This is a deliberate use of an ambiguous word. Will the city of Nineveh be overturned, or will it be turned around? Well, the Hebrew author says with a glimmer in his eye, you have to keep reading to find out. And on that topic, purposeful ambiguity is a huge thing in Hebrew literature. The ambiguity placed in the text is not due to it having a poor author who can't seem to communicate clearly. An example of this can be found in Genesis 32:24, the story of Jacob wrestling a stranger in the night. Who did Jacob wrestle with? Was it a man? An angel? Was it God? Now, if you thought the English translation was confusing, the Hebrew version is even worse than the translation, as in it's even more confusing and murky. This ambiguity tool is applied on purpose, for effect. It brings us into what would have been Jacob's experience. The night was dark, vague, and confusing. He's anxious and afraid. It gives the reader a look into Jacob's emotions. It highlights the mystery of the divine encounter. And though it becomes clear to Jacob later in the text who it is that he's been wrestling with, while he was wrestling, he didn't know. And so this purposeful ambiguity is appealing to the imagination of the readers, drawing us into the confusion of the text, helping us to understand Jacob's reactions. Another thing we'll find in the Old Testament text is one story told in a way as to remind us of another story. Now, in this next example, there is a trigger warning, a mention of rape. If you'd like to skip past this part, that's not a problem. We'll put a timestamp in the description below this video where you can rejoin us. Okay, so in the first verses of Genesis 18, Abraham sees three strangers. Abraham bows down to them, Abraham offers the strangers hospitality, and Abraham provides them with food. We're going to touch on this again, but hospitality was a big part of ancient Near Eastern culture in a way that may seem very foreign to some of us. Welcoming, honoring, housing, feeding strangers was very central to the so-called moral code of Near Eastern society, and remains true in much of the Middle East today. It is seen as a horrible thing to not show generous hospitality to strangers. So Genesis 18 tells us that Abraham was a very hospitable man, kind to strangers. Ergo, in this culture, ergo, in this culture, Abraham is an honorable man. He is a righteous man. Now, in the very next chapter, chapter 19, we find a story about Lot. Lot was Abraham's nephew, and he's living in a city with his family. And chapter 19 tells us a story with a very similar pattern to chapter 18. Strangers come to the city, Lot meets them and bows down, Lot insists on housing and feeding them, he offers them protection, very much mirroring the actions of his uncle. Might the reader then be led to conclude similarly about Lot as Abraham, that Lot is an honorable, a righteous man? One might assume so. But then there is a divergence in the story of Lot, because all the men of the city approach his house, asking for Lot to hand over the strangers so that they may rape them. Lot refuses, and instead he offers his daughters to the men. The author is lining up the similarities between Abraham and Lot on purpose, making that one difference at the end stand out even more by contrast. Because this doesn't follow the pattern of Abraham's actions, causing the reader to pause and notice this one difference, asking, was it right for Lot to protect these strangers but offer his daughters? And this is a difference being brought attention to between Lot and Abraham, highlighting a part of one story by reminding us of another. The use of repetition is common in both Hebrew narratives and poetry. The repetition of words, of a phrase, of similar events within a single story. And alongside that are repetitions that contain variations. We find an example of this in Judges 13 from verse 2. There was a certain man of Zorah, of the tribe of the Danites, whose name was Manoah. His wife was barren, having borne no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, although you are barren, having borne no children, you shall conceive and bear a son. Now be careful not to drink wine or strong drink, or to eat anything unclean, for you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor is to come on his head, for the boy shall be a Nazarite to God from birth. It is he who shall begin to deliver Israel from the hands of the Philistines. Now the woman the angel spoke to goes to her husband, Manoah, and reports on what the angel has told her. Verse 6. Then the woman came and told her husband, a man of God came to me, and his appearance was like that of an angel of God, most awe-inspiring. I did not ask him where he came from, and he did not tell me his name, but he said to me, you shall conceive and bear a son. So then drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean, for the boy shall be a Nazarite to God from birth to the day of his death. You may notice here that in her report, the woman leaves something out of what the angel told her. She leaves out the bit about her son beginning to deliver Israel from the Philistines. During this time period, the Philistines were a neighboring people who oppressed Israel and ruled over them. Thus the promise of a man who will begin breaking the Philistines' grip. But why would an Israelite woman leave that detail out? Wouldn't this be good news to her? The author highlights this variation in the repetition to us. Likely, In the woman's mind, this deliverance of Israel and the death of her son were connected. And so, as though to shrink back from that awful part of the story about his death, she leaves the delivering part out. And of course, the irony of this is all highlighted by the fact that Samson, her son, would later on make it his last act to bring down a building on top of Philistine lords and is killed in the process himself, dying as part of the deliverance, so to speak. Another Hebrew peculiarity is something called anadromes. This is where a word can be spelled backwards to make another word. In English, stressed and desserts are anadromes of each other. The same goes for drawer and reward. Anadromes were applied in the ancient world in a playful and sometimes meaningful way, where an anadrome could say something about a word or name. The theory is that the capital city of the Roman Empire was an anadrome. Rome, in Latin, is Roma. Turn it around, we get amor, which in Latin and today's Italian means love. The Romans viewed their city as the city of love. And so, though there is the mythology of the twins Romulus and Remus, Romulus founding the city of Rome, the anadrome of Roma is also likely a playful use of language. Now, most of the peculiarities or styles we've looked at so far have mainly related to the first main category of Hebrew literature, namely narrative. We now turn to some peculiarities in Hebrew poetry. Each language has its own style or styles of poetry. Typically, Hebrew poetry is one line that relates to another, so they match. And then this is repeated throughout the poem. We find a lot of this in the book of Psalms, for example. We have our first line called a colon, our second line called a bicolon, and then sometimes even a third connected line called trocolon. So depending on whether or not we have 2 or 3 related lines, we end up with a bicola or a tricola. One cola is a unit of poetry. Let's look at some examples. We'll look at a short psalm, Psalm 13, written by David. This is what the whole psalm looks like. And now we can begin to identify these related lines. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? The second line matches, echoes, or relates to the first. It is expressing a thought one way and then expressing it again a slightly different but related way. Verse 2, here we have a tricolon, 3 lines that are related and match. How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Verse 3, consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. Another bicolon. Verse 4, and my enemy will say, I have prevailed. My foes will rejoice because I am shaken. A bicolon. Verse 5, but I trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. Again, a bicolon. Verse 6, I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. So here we see the stylistic Hebrew poetry. And we can even find this style in Hebrew narrative too, at the very beginning of the Bible, the first 2 chapters of Genesis. First, we hear the creation story in Genesis 1. Then we hear the creation story again in Genesis 2, told slightly different, 2 related things, as though looking at the same experience, the same event, the same truth from 2 slightly different angles or viewpoints. It's interesting how this style mirrors Hebrew thinking, this and that. In the 18th century, a bishop and Oxford professor called Robert Laud wrote extensively about how to understand Hebrew poetry, and he dubbed this approach parallelism. which is what we've talked about, parallels between lines. He broke this down into 3 categories: synonymism, the meaning of a line repeated in the next but in a different way. An example can be found in Psalm 24:1. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it. The second type, antithetic, which is a mirror image, for example, positive versus negative. An example is in Psalm 1:6. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. And finally, synthetic, which is related lines that don't fall into the first 2 categories. And you can try this out for yourself. Go through any psalm and see this pattern of 2 or 3 related lines and what category of parallelism they fall into. Another poetry example is something called acrostic. Acrostic poems have lines beginning in alphabetical order, according to, of course, the Hebrew alphabet. There are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. A typical example of the acrostic tool being used is in Psalm 119. This can also be called an alphabetical poem. Psalm 119 is divided into 22 sections, one for each Hebrew letter. Each section has 16 lines, and that section's letter appears at the start of each alternate line. So, for example, the first 8 verses contain 16 lines of poetry, and every other line begins with Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The next section, verses 9 to 16, each verse begins with the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Bet. Legend states that King David, who wrote Psalm 119, used it to teach his son Solomon the alphabet, how to read, going through each of the letters. The Book of Lamentations is also based on an acrostic structure built around the alphabet. Now, both in narrative and poetry in the Bible, there is something called a chiastic structure. This literary device is really common, and we'll find it in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. The best way to think of a chiasm is to picture a pyramid. And within this pyramid, we'll find certain words or events which are repeated in reverse order, so that they sort of mirror each other. And at the middle, at the center, is the one thing that doesn't mirror anything else. And this is done on purpose. That middle part is the central point, the golden nugget, the most important thing that the text is trying to bring attention to, like a sort of pointed arrow. So a chiasm is a repetition of similar ideas in the reverse sequence. Another way to refer to a chiasm is a meaning sandwich, because as we said, the outer parts are sandwiching the main point. Now, we're not too used to this in Western literature. Typically, it is at the conclusion, at the end of something, that we find the crowning jewel, the bottom line, and the finale, but not so in Hebrew literature. The middle of the chiasm is where we find the heart of the story or the thought. Let's have a look at an example of a narrative chiasm. Here is the chiastic structure of the story of Noah and the flood. We see that in either end it begins the same way, Noah and his sons. And the central point in the middle of the chiasm, found in Genesis 8:1, God remembers Noah. And we now know that this is the central point, the heart of the story, that God remembers Noah. You can find this device used in much smaller spaces too, within a single verse. Matthew 23:12. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled. Whoever humbles himself will be exalted. The central point here is humility. Again, Genesis 9:6. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. An emphasis is being placed on the importance of a human, valuing human life. This was chiastic structure in a small space. You can also find chiastic structures in spaces as large as an entire book. The book of Leviticus is a great example of this. And when you start to see the implications of what it's trying to draw attention to, it's actually quite remarkable. Leviticus, chapters mirroring each other in a pyramid, a staircase, leading to the central chapters 16 and part of 17, which are about the Day of Atonement. All the laws, the priestly services, the instructions about how the tabernacle services are to be carried out, the feasts, the festivals, the holy days, the clean and unclean laws, it's all leading to that, the Day of Atonement. And so the reader must then ask themselves, well, what's that about? What is the Day of Atonement? Why is it so important? Just to clarify, this is not us going in and imposing a pattern on the text that was never really there. Hebrew authors used this storytelling tool constantly. It was a style of explaining meaning in literature. Now, we've looked mostly at chiastic structures within narratives, but we can also find them in poetry. Here is an example of a small chiasm, Psalm 33:6. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. Another example, the entirety of Psalm 146 is a chiasm. Verse 1 and 10b, praise the Lord. Verse 2 and 7 to 10a, praise God for what he's done, stating the things God has done. And then at the center, verses 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, man is not the ultimate help. He dies. Blessed is he who puts their trust in God's help. So the praise is leading to the reason for that praise, the fact that God helps. That is the central point of Psalm 146. So to conclude this section about Hebrew poetry, it is safe to say that many Western readers do not really understand the nature of Hebrew poetry. It can help to keep in mind that while Hebrew narrative does not give us a lot of poetic or extensive insight into the psychology and emotions of the characters or the narrator, Hebrew poetry puts the author's emotions and feelings front stage. It's important to not mix these genres up and to understand their various devices. We'll touch more on this when we look at genre. But for today, we've laid a good groundwork for the first principles of exegesis and an introduction to the world of the Old Testament biblical literature. The end of today's class comes with a parting gift, or curse, depending on how you feel about it. Namely, a bit of homework, an activity for you to do by yourself. You are invited to carry out an exegesis of Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3, before our next class. You are challenged to exegete the text. Don't worry about it being perfect. The point of this exercise is to get us into the habit of exegeting, of using the tools we learned today, the steps, the process that we went through. As with most of our work together, please use the recommended Bible versions. In this, please use the NRSV version. If you don't own a copy, you can find it online, for example, on BibleGateway.com. Look up the text in the NRSV UE version. I know this is a long name. It is simply the name for the most updated version of the NRSV. So take notes, see what you find, and then we'll go through this chapter together at the beginning of our next class and see what we came up with. Tomorrow we dive headlong into narrative, particularly the world of Hebrew narrative. Until next time, see you then.